Good afternoon. It's my privilege to introduce our next panel, which will be on the next generation of global technology platforms. And it'll be moderated by Dr. Eric Schmidt, the NSCAI chairman. And we'll be welcoming our participants to the stage just momentarily. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming our participants.
Good afternoon. I think speaking for the entire commission, we're so thankful that everyone has taken their time to come and spend some time on these subjects. The report reception has been fantastic, and a lot of it has been due to your hard work. I'll be speaking a bit later in the wrap-up, so I think what we should do is get right to the panel. And let me just lay it out in a few sentences that America faces competition, both from China and others, at the platform level that is profound. The reason this platform issue is so important is the platforms that are built now are being built globally, and those platforms have huge downside effects, whether it's the creation of trillion-dollar companies, or national security, or huge gains to society. So the stakes could never be higher. We have three panelists, Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, Risto Siilasmaa, who is the founder and chairman of F-Secure, former board chairman of Nokia, and Dr. Reshma Shetty, who is a computer scientist, now a PhD in biology, and now co-founders of a Bioworks company. So thank you. Let's dive right in. So Sam, you and I worked together for a very, very long time. And you were the head of Y Combinator for many years. You're very, very involved in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And then you took over OpenAI as a co-founder and built it. And last year, you had a remarkable result, at least to me, which was GPT-3. And in that particular model, you learned some things that were a surprise. And now, in the last year, working with Microsoft and others, I think you're working on a model that is, I'll just say, 10 times larger. What are these models useful for? What do they do?
Well, thanks for the nice words about GPT-3, and thanks for having me here. I think what we're seeing now is the dawn of the general purpose AI age. So before this, we had an AI system that could eventually learn to drive a car or read a radiology scan. But what's useful about these models is they can learn and adapt to new things that they haven't seen before. So with GPT-3, which is a text model, the same model can do, it can chat with you, it can do text summarization, it can search in natural language, but it can also learn to do new things with just a few examples. And that, I think, points a glimpse towards the future of what will be a transformative technological shift, where the computer systems that we learn that we use can learn whatever we need them to learn, sort of eventually like a human does. Just maybe it's 2 weeks ago now, we released a model with Microsoft in GitHub that can write computer code. That also, I think, will get better on a very steep curve. Earlier this year, we released a model that can generate images. And I think what we're going to see is these very powerful general purpose models that can do many tasks that traditionally you would have needed humans to do and to learn. And we will not only be able to make an AI coder, but eventually an AI doctor, an AI lawyer, and an AI teacher. And we will use these to sort of massively increase quality of life for people.
So as a follow-up, so the announcement last week, the AI coder with Microsoft, has been a huge phenomenon in computer science. People are really impressed by it and are thinking, what's next? In your opinion, will this technology eventually be human-guided programming? Will it be computer-guided programming? Will it be a hybrid? How good can the current programming assistant become, in your view?
I am certain that with our current approaches, with our current algorithms, and what we know how to do, we will hit limits. I don't know what they'll be. When we've guessed that in the past, things that we thought would be easy were hard, things that we thought were hard would be easy. I think the dream of being able to say, I want this computer to write me a program that does this very complicated thing, that is a very long way away. But what I do think is in sight is something where we can guide the computer step by step through what we want it to do, and it will write code for that. And I think a reason that's going to be so important, even if it's only for very simple tasks, is that is fundamentally a new computer interface enabled by AI, which is where you say what you want the computer to do, a simple task, and it does it. And because there are APIs for so much of the internet, once a computer can write even the very unsophisticated, simple code it can write now, it can accomplish complex tasks for you. And so it's this super powerful tool and a new way to interact with computers where you say, in any language you want, any human language, do this thing, and the computer does it. And I think this is an example of, it is going to go there, even if it doesn't go all the way to the computer writing the full complex program.
Let me ask a few more questions of all the panelists, and then we'll see if we can get into a group conversation of the implications of this. So Risto, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. And thank you for participating in our hybrid format. What do you believe are going to be the security challenges going forward? You've done a lot of work in security. You're doing a security company now. When I talk to normal people, which is I defined as non-computer science people, what they basically say is, why are these systems not secure? Why can't you guys fix this? What is wrong with you? That's roughly the way it actually comes out. Can you talk about the state of security, network security, and the implications therein?
Sure. The systems are not secure because they are not simple. And they are not simple for two reasons. One is that parts of the system are very, very old. Unfortunately, much of the foundation of today's networking is decades old. And anybody who reads through that code would be at least scared, if not ashamed, that it still exists. But it's also insecure because we're trying to do very complicated things, and we need lots of versatility. For cybersecurity, I think we face a lot of different challenges that relate to AI. Some of those are opportunities, but they come with the flavor of disaster built in. And if I would just mention one, we sort of have a paradigm where we believe that the most sophisticated attacks are hands-on keyboard attacks done by talented, well-trained people, mostly employed by governments. And to defend against those attacks, we also have to have experts with their hands on a keyboard. And I believe this will change. We can train AI-based attack systems that can be, with sufficient resources, can be trained on a similar environment, that is the target environment. And as typically today, these hands-on keyboard attacks can take weeks or even months to reach the ultimate target. This can change to happen in minutes. And if this starts to happen, then defending with hands-on keyboard will not be possible anymore. And once again, in cybersecurity, we are in a race where we have to build the defensive systems that can tackle automated, sophisticated attacks. And one of our problems is that we don't have enough training data. And of course, the best way to create training data is to create automated attack systems, which will then generate training data for us. And for example, in my company, we have done that. We just recently announced that we have built a reinforcement learning-based real-life system for privilege escalation in Windows. And that's of course a tiny portion of the attack chain, but it works very well. And it's easy to add other modules to that. And I think this is something that we as a society, internet society, we are not prepared for.
So in artificial intelligence, for the audience that may not know, the most interesting systems all use objective functions, and they have to pass a test, and they're trained against this objective function. How do I get there, and so forth. It seems to me that the objective function of breaking in is a pretty easy training goal, and that we're going to take your observation about automated attacks, and we're going to see an explosion of real and simulated attacks to try to build the objective function to break in. You could imagine a situation where this gets so crazy that it's sort of like Bitcoin in the sense that it uses an enormous amount of computers to do things to other computers. How do we get this under control? Do you think that ultimately governments will have to have treaties that prevent this? Or is there a way on the defensive side where you could make the cost of that training so high that people won't undertake it?
Well, that's a great question. The challenge with governmental cyber attacks is that it fulfills 3 criteria for the attacker. First of all, it's quite easy. It's pretty simple to find talented engineers that can be trained how to attack computer systems. It's very cheap. These attacks don't cost much compared to traditional warfare, for example, or traditional espionage. And you have deniability. It's really hard to prove, as the United States has found out over the last several years with Russia and China. It's really hard to prove without any doubt who the attacker is. And because of these 3 things, it's simple, it's cheap, and it's deniable. We will definitely see much more government activity, and treaties won't stop it because it's deniable, and it's so cheap, and it's so simple. It's too attractive. So I think we'll just have to do whatever we can on the defensive side, but of course also to start treating cyber attacks more seriously. In many cases, these attacks attack the heart of our society. People's trust in their government, people's trust in the judiciary, people's trust in the media. This is more serious than a small-scale border attack where one person is hurt. But if that would happen, people would be up in arms, and it would be a huge scandal. Whereas attacks to the heart of our societies are, it just happens. Who cares? We'll just move on. And I think we need to change our attitude and start taking cyber attacks more seriously, which is happening, but very slowly.
Thank you, and hopefully it won't be because of some major cyber attack that forces that. Now, Reshma, I've been waiting to find a person who's a computer scientist and a biologist to ask this question for a long time. So, biologists talk about biobanks, and biobanks are full of data around biology. So, can you start by defining why a biobank is interesting, what you can do with it, and how we're doing on this? In our report, we acknowledge that China is building a very powerful biobank. Is the US doing the same? Do we have an alternative approach? How do we solve this problem?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start by talking about what do we mean by a biobank, right? And I think different people can mean different things when they use that term, but I think you could sort of roughly divide it into, a lot of people talk about biobanks and they talk about human specimens, right? For clinical purposes, I want to do clinical research, and sort of the value of that is actually sort of fairly obvious. There's obviously a set of privacy concerns that come along with that. But I think there's actually other kinds of biobanks and biodata that are actually also equally economically important, right? So one is okay, instead of individual human samples, what if I want to collect information on schools or cities, right? With the COVID pandemic, we have developed now wastewater surveillance, right? So I can go measure wastewater and look at the COVID levels, and that's actually an earlier predictor of outbreaks than individual testing is, in fact, at least in this pandemic. And then there's non-human DNA, right? So, you know, US has a huge variety of ecosystems and ecological niches. Like, what are all the genetic information that's available to us here? That's actually a very rich economic resource for us, right? Because you can take that information, it's ultimately A's, T's, G's, and C's, it's digital sequence information, and I can actually leverage it to then go reprogram biology to do new things and generate huge amounts of new applications and therefore economic potential. And so I think when we think about biobanks and biological data, we need to think about that full gamut. China, via BGI, certainly is thinking that way, and they are sequencing everything from, you know, human specimens through environmental. And we have had, obviously, a history of genome sequencing projects in this country as well, but I would say that we've only scratched the surface, and we're certainly, I would argue, behind China with respect to collecting this type of information that you can use for, ultimately, for cell programming purposes.
So if we follow Risto's observation that the cost of entry to building attack systems is low, the same would also be true for biology in the following sense. There will be very powerful tools that will be on the equivalent of GitHub and so forth that will be open source. There will be lots of data in these biobanks. So how do we know that 1,000 evil people or 10,000 evil people, I'm sure there's that many people in a world of 8 billion people, won't organize themselves to start doing this stuff? Because the cost of entry is relatively low compared to what it used to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact of the matter is with biological technologies, they are diffuse, they are everywhere, right? And so this is not like nuclear, right? Nuclear we could sort of lock down and restrict access to. That's not the case with biological technologies. That being said, it's not, to maybe put your mind at ease, it's not trivial to do these things, right? You know, if you want to do cell culture and whatnot, it does require certain facilities, certain expertise. But I won't pretend like the threat is non-existent. And so I think this is something that, you know, again, the COVID-19 pandemic has sort of highlighted just how important this issue is, where even if you ignore engineered threats, just the natural threats that are out there, we need to be prepared for them. And we weren't, I would argue, in the case of this pandemic. And so thinking about it from both a public health and a biosecurity perspective, I think, is really important.
So continuing on this theme, so Sam, again, you and I have spoken over the years about what's going to happen with these large universal models, which I think, frankly, you all pioneered, so I'll give you credit for that. And now a whole bunch of people are trying to build trillion parameter models, which are, for purposes of argument, a factor of 10 larger than last year's state of the art. I noticed with some concern last week that China announced that they had done one too. And I have run around telling confidently in my I'm confident tone that China was a few years behind in this space. Clearly, I was wrong. Is there going to be a global competition around these models, right? In the same sense we're talking about the competition in these other areas. And the other argument that I've made to you is that there will be relatively a small number of competitors, which is code for nation states. And I think in your case, because this stuff is so hard, although it's true that lots of evil people could do it, in fact, it'll be nation states that'll have the resources to do that. So Sam, do you believe that at the end of the day, using your comment about nuclear, that eventually these things will be super powerful supercomputers that cost, I don't know, hundreds of millions of dollars to operate, which means there won't be that many of them? Will they have armed guards and be secure, and will they be in, you know, fenced facilities and all of the things that we've seen in nuclear?
Yes to all of that. I think there will be a global, I hate to use the word race, but there will be multiple global efforts to build these powerful AI systems. And the best way for us to get the outcome that we want in the world, AI that is aligned with liberal democratic values and that works to preserve that, is for us and our allies to build it ourselves first. I think we should do everything we can to be collaborative. I think the race conditions, as people in the AI safety community have spoken about for a long time, are quite bad. We should avoid that. But I do think we need to be very clear that what we need to have the world that we want is to technically build AI, decide on the set of values that we want to embed in that AI, and then, and this is a place where OpenAI, I think, has done some great work, align those systems to the values that we want to have. And then we and our allies do that together. We be as collaborative and friendly with the rest of the world as we can. But be very clear that there are some incompatible value systems in the world, and we want these systems that we deploy that are going to do unimaginably powerful things to maintain and promote what we care about. And it is going to be a global environment. We should be clear about that. I think, as you said, like China is now a clear participant in that. And we're going to do the best work we can, and we want to work with everyone that's sort of aligned with thinking about our way of the world to make sure that we get the future that we all want and deserve. I do think there will be a relatively small number of players. As you mentioned, these systems just get not only tremendously expensive, but tremendously complex. And there won't be that many efforts that are sort of really at the edge of scale here. And then I think it's similar to the other global platforms. This happens to be the one that I know the most about, but when I think about the next couple of decades, I sort of think about AI, biotech, sort of computer infrastructure, security, chips, everything else, and energy. And I think they're all going to play out as there are certain decisions that touch on the very heart of the intersection of society and technology. And that if we want to push those decisions where we'd like them to go, we have to be incredibly competitive. We have to be incredibly at the forefront of technology. And that's what we're trying to do. And that goes for the full stack. That goes from thinking about how to make sure we have enough supply of chips to data sets that are as big and as unbiased as we can get them to be. Those are two places where I think governments can really help. The algorithmic development, we're on sort of a nice trajectory, and we'll continue to try to do better. And then the sort of cross-sectoral social input in how we want these systems to behave and how we make sure that this gets to a society that is much better for everyone, which I firmly believe is going to happen. I think people have spoken a lot about the deflationary pressures of tech. They really haven't seen anything compared to the deflationary pressures of AI. We can all have just phenomenally better and more affordable lives every year from here on. But that is a complex societal shift, and we need a ton of input and partnership to all get there.
You mentioned the race conditions. Are there any that you're particularly worried about?
If you think about, let's say you can imagine two goals. You can say, I would like to build a powerful AI system. And then you can say, I would like to build a safe, powerful AI system that is not going to accidentally do something or intentionally let someone break into a computer. It is my belief that goal number 2 is a proper superset of goal number 1. It's just harder. And that's okay, we can do it. And actually, a thing that I'm really happy about is as we've done our research and work, I think it is not so much harder than option 1. It's not as, I was very fearful, we call it like a tax on training. I was very fearful that safety and alignment would be like a 1,000% tax on training. And that would then be really bad. But if it's only a few percent, it's not that bad and we can do it. But we still want the time to make sure that the systems that we build and deploy in the world are as safe and as aligned with liberal democratic values as possible and as unbiased as possible. And we don't want to have to rush to put them out first in a competition. So that's where I think not racing is really important. And even with people we don't like, I think we need to make a joint commitment to safety, to not race to deploy unsafe systems.
What's interesting to me is that with both cyber and biotech in one form or another, and then core AI research, you have the same unifying problem, which is you have to develop the platform and it has to be done safely. So let's ask you, with respect to biology, can it be done in a safe way, right? And the reason I'm asking is that the possibility of re-engineering, right, which goes back to the original recombinant DNA work, 30 years ago, has been known for a long time, but the tools were too expensive. And we're in some period where these tools are going to get cheap enough that it'll be possible to begin to do things. There are many, many positives, the accelerated drugs, problems that have bedeviled humans for history. How do you score whether we're likely to get through this with the, I'll just call it the Sam Altman optimism, right?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I'll actually go back to something Risto alluded to, which is that I think one of the mistakes we made in the very early days of the internet and computer networking is that we didn't bake in security and safety into our thinking when we designed those systems. And I think in bio, in the very, very early days, obviously now we do think about it a lot, but in bio, I think we've tried in the synthetic biology community to sort of bake in security and safety, at least into the ethos, the culture around this community. And I think, and then I think the COVID-19 pandemic has further accelerated that, at least for me in the community I'm in. It's it sort of drove home just how important it is to couple development of the platform with development of the safety and security measures that go along with the platform. And so I think those need to sort of be in lockstep, right? Just like you have fintech, you have fraud prevention and detection, right? With bio, you need to have biosafety and biosecurity that goes along with it. And so the investments need to sort of span both when you think about building out these platforms. It's really important.
Do you believe at the end of the day, China is going to win this race, given they're ahead at the moment? And in the tech world that I come from, if you're ahead, you can stay ahead with enough investment and techniques.
I believe that China will be a major player. I don't think it's going to be just one dominant player. I think there will be a few in the world, and I think China will be one of them.
Can I respond to the optimism throwaway comment? I think
it was a compliment. It was not a throwaway comment.
Well, no, I think this is actually a really important point because I think it's possible to screw this up in either direction. What I strive to be, and what I think we all should strive to be, is cautious and prudent without being paralyzed by fear. I think that we are, for sure, to say it as bluntly as I can, on the cusp of major changes, some of which you have up here, which are capable of an incredibly bad outcome. And in fact, more and more people that I know, when they talk about the Fermi paradox and sort of where are the aliens, why aren't there other advanced societies, they just say too much technology at once, we can't survive it. I certainly don't believe that to be the case, but I think anyone who takes a sober look at the change likely to happen in the next couple of decades has to say wow, this is going to require all of us to put aside our differences, make some very hard decisions, and not do the stupid stuff that competitive nation states could normally do in a race. But if we do nothing, which is something that I hear more and more people advocating, I think we are certain to get stomped by other actors who don't have the values that we do. And so we have to move forward, and we have to do it as cautiously as possible, where we still show up to win the game.
And I might take that even one step further and say, the people who develop and use platforms have an outsized influence in who benefits from those platforms, right? And so we've talked a lot today about the importance of, democracies and like-minded countries, participating in development of these emerging technologies. But I would probably go a step further and say we need to make sure that there's a diverse set of people from those democracies who are participating in the development of these platforms, right? We need to make sure, people of color, people from other backgrounds, make sure it is the international community, people from underrepresented genders. Like, we need a very diverse group of voices from even just the democracies themselves to be developing these platforms if we want to ensure that the benefits of these platforms actually accrue to a diverse cross-section of society.
One of the sort of
Eric,
truisms. Go ahead, Risto.
can I chime in as well?
Yeah, go ahead, Risto.
Yeah, I fully agree with Sam's optimism. We will see wonderful things from the AI technology impacting all of our lives in a positive way. But I'm quite cautious regarding cybersecurity. We do have an uphill battle, and we shouldn't be too optimistic about that. The other comment that I wanted to make is also related to what Sam said earlier about centralization of computing resources. And that definitely holds true, but it might not hold true fully for cybersecurity. Because what cybersecurity is today, it's a huge pipeline of data that we pull from different computing systems to analyze and correlate and cross-correlate using different filters and systems and analytics to figure out if something is going wrong. And of course, we pull some of that data from the cloud systems, but most of that data is still pulled from end devices, which people use to access the cloud systems. And there are two problems with this. First of all, we pull everything from those end devices. We know what emails people receive. We know what emails they send, which attachments they have, what applications they use, which applications are launched by other applications, what kind of command line patches they run, and so forth and so forth. And some of this information is very confidential. And companies don't like the fact that a third party pulls it out from their networks and their devices and their cloud systems. So I think we'll see also a rise of sort of a swarm intelligence where we leave that data in the devices and we just teach those devices to do the analytics and share some of those findings with the neighboring devices. And of course, sending them back to the decentralized cloud as well, but much less data than is being sent today. And the swarm intelligence is, of course, a very interesting area of academic research in AI, and it is needed.
So when I go back to my own history in networking, we used to have a saying of all the laws of networking were always wrong, because the network was never secure, it was never always available, it was never always open, and so forth. There are new technologies called homomorphic encryption and others which allow you that are essentially do privacy-preserving transactions. So one hope is that our industry will develop techniques which don't expose the privacy and the vulnerability to the end user to the whole cloud. Now, when you think about all of this, and I put it all together, I go back to something I used to think, and I want to ask if it's true. I've always argued that it was actually better to be a defender than offensive in cyber, because it's true in military terms that the offensive side has the element of surprise. But because these systems are trained, the defender, by definition, has more training data because the defender is always being attacked. So one way to argue against what you said earlier, which was the ease of using essentially reinforcement learning on the offensive side, is that the defenders, and now I'm thinking specifically of the large cloud companies, and there are probably other choices as well, have so much experience being attacked that they can build learning systems too. Do you believe that, or do you think I'm just fundamentally wrong?
No, I think you are quite correct regarding these giants of the industry. But any individual company that is trying to protect their own end devices, their own systems, some of which are in the cloud, they are not being attacked that much. And they don't get the data, they don't get the experience. Their cybersecurity people don't get the training. However, third-party cybersecurity companies that protect tens, hundreds, thousands of companies will get that experience and will get that data. So I think it's all a question of the structure of the industry. Who can aggregate that data? And how can we use that aggregated data to protect others?
Now, Sam, we talk in our report about how to get AI broader. And one of the things that we talk about is the need for a national research cloud. And you have yourself talked about, I'll just summarize it, the importance of having multiple GPU, TPU players, lots of new entrants, university research, startups, not just in the province of the very rich tech companies. Take us through, what does that system look like, right? What is it going to take to build the vision that you have of not just the political partnerships, but the technical partnerships, people working on common platforms? What does it look like?
So again, these these sort of three stools of AI progress: algorithms, data, and compute. Algorithms are actually fairly widely shared, not perfectly, but people do talk about what they're working on and publish it, and that's led to huge amounts of progress in the field. Data, there's lots of data, it turns out, available on the internet, and a lot of efforts have found the data that they need. But compute is a real challenge, and compute is outside of the scope of most individual efforts. There's wonderful new research happening into sort of new chips that could have a sort of incredible step change function into what we're capable of from a hardware perspective. But this takes huge amounts of investment. The learning curve to start using a new chip a new chip architecture is high. And the scale that you need these at is outside of the reach of most efforts. So one thing that I think gets lost in the discussion is that it's not enough to actually just build the new piece of silicon or whatever. You actually have to make it easy to program. And you'd like it to be easy to move from one to another. And so I think like people talk about the NVIDIA chip advantage all the time, and I think one thing that gets lost is the NVIDIA software advantage. And so we're much more likely to use NVIDIA's hardware because their software is so good. But what I'd love to see happen is a huge and distributed effort for advanced hardware, a software layer above all of that where people can easily plug in and try to run their models on new hardware, and then some sort of industry and government coordination to make a lot of that hardware available in the cloud at scale.
So now let's ask the same question for you, on the same question in biology.
Okay.
So, and I'm phrasing it as a computer scientist, but you understand what I'm getting at. One of the pandemic, of course, is horrific, but it has moved biology forward very, very quickly. And now you're beginning to see collaborations, sharing of information. Historically, biologists have not been very good at sharing information. The industrial structure of the drug companies is not to share for intellectual property reasons, et cetera. One idea, which is to sort of try to build common infrastructure for biologists. I'll use my terms, which are a cloud service for biology, for lack of a better term. What does it look like to build standardized platforms? And again, when I say platforms, I'm referring to platforms in the West under Western values as opposed to the Chinese model. So that includes the concerns about privacy and rights and so forth and so on. Do you foresee, or is it possible to build such a database? And then I'll ask the same question about cyber, right? Can we build these platforms that will accelerate the industry to get to the right outcome?
Yeah, so I think the platforms in biology you can sort of think about in layers, right? So right now we have a pretty robust ecosystem in this country of what are called the life science tools players, like the DNA synthesis companies, the DNA sequencing companies, the reagents companies, the robotics companies. These are all the ones who provide the picks and shovels for designing biology. I think we need to keep an eye on it because every one of those has peers in China, right? And so if we lose those companies, the way we've lost certain companies in the semiconductor space in this country, like that will erode our advantage significantly. But right now, reasonably strong ecosystem there. I would say then the next layer up, at least when you're talking about the design of biological systems, right? So programming cells to do new functions. That is a layer that is still being built. So like my company, Ginkgo Bioworks, is certainly trying to build that layer and open it up to places. And so there's a handful of companies that are trying to build that layer. There's a lot smaller number of them because programming biology is hard, right? We're not very good at it still. And there are sort of scale economics and whatnot that mean that tends to be pretty centralized. And so you could easily imagine that gets down to just a small number of players in the world. And then on top of that is sort of the applications layer, right? Which is like the companies who want to use engineered cells to do something. Oh, I'm Impossible Foods and I want to make a burger that, you know, that is not from animals, right? So I need to be able to engineer a cell to make animal proteins. Or I'm an ag company and I want to be able to use less fertilizer when I grow corn, and so I'm going to engineer microbes to fix nitrogen for me, right? And so that's the ecosystem that lies on top. And so I would argue that cell programming layer is the one where we operate, but also where, you know, there's sort of a pretty strong competitive dynamic, right, that we need to think about. And if we want to have the foundational capabilities in cell programming and engineering biology in this country or in the Western countries in general, then, you know, that's the one to keep an eye on, in my view.
Well, I think one of the things the government is learning is don't abandon an important domestic industry like semiconductors. So in the 90s, and I was in part of the conversations, I remember, oh, it's fine, we'll just let the Asian countries do it because they'll do it more efficiently, and we got out of it. Mm-hmm. By the way, we also got out of a lot of the telecom work, and now we're looking at the 5G situation. So I think that's one of the core lessons, and you're participating in it. Risto, I'll ask you the final question, and then we'll move to audience questions. In your field, both active and defensive systems, are there platforms that could get built? Today, my impression of cyber security is it's essentially university researchers, these various network security companies which are specialized, and then the cloud providers, and then the legacy systems. Is there a way to build a common layer or a group of people who would advance the field in the same way that these two have said, let's do the same in biology and in AI?
I'm not sure if it would be possible, but I'm pretty sure that it's unlikely to happen.
Well, that's cheery.
And it hasn't happened in the two other fields either, not yet. It's theoretically possible in those fields as well. But what I can say is that the cybersecurity industry over the last 35 years, the first computer virus appeared 35 years ago. Very early on, the industry determined that we will not want someone to have a competitive advantage because they found a piece of malware that they are not sharing with anybody else. And then they are promoting their own protection because they are the only one that can protect against that particular malware. And the industry started sharing samples, just like in the medical field, one might share virus samples or DNA data. And in cybersecurity, for 35 years, we have shared data about the threats. And that's going to continue, and it has to continue. But sharing solutions and sharing technologies, that is not happening. It's pretty much the same as what Sam talked about. And the one additional challenge is that governments don't typically understand technology. There are very, very few people, decision makers, that truly understand machine learning, for example, that have bothered to really dig down deep into what does it mean, how does it work. And because they don't understand, it's very difficult for them to create these international platforms. Because companies are typically bad at creating those. Governments need to help, and they don't know what they're talking about.
Thank you. Let's get to some audience questions and comments. We have a little bit of time. We have some mics. Who would like to ask the first question? Don't be shy. Yes? Yes? We'll wait till someone asks the question. In the way back, in the way corner. And I think if you could identify yourself, that'd be great.
Sure. I'm Tina. I'm with the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI. I want to go back and talk about the NRC idea that you were discussing. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on reasons why we shouldn't build an NRC, some considerations like ethical considerations or concerns, just reasons why we should not build one.
NRC means National Research
Yes,
Cloud.
sorry. National Research Cloud.
Heavily and well promoted by Stanford and a number of the other leading universities. Thank you all for your support for this idea. Sam.
I'd love to see it happen. I don't think I have something deep and sophisticated to say here. I think it would be a really good thing, and we've been vocal in our support for it.
The answer is complete and unqualified endorsement from all of us to your effort. Go ahead. Next question.
Hi, my name is Rahul. I'm with the National Defense Industrial Association. So normal people, in the words of Dr. Schmidt, might understandably be concerned about like the implications of artificial intelligence or biotechnology, and how that can be used for maybe like prying into private information or whatever. And I'm wondering, like, how can you strike the balance between being transparent about these kinds of things while also protecting from peering eyes in other countries or maintaining some level of security?
Both of you?
I think in the bio domain, I don't think secrecy works well as a strategy. I think the best strategy is run as fast as possible. And so, the way you achieve biosecurity, in my view, is by building those platforms, by having the leading edge of those technologies. Because, personally, I think, biology is too ubiquitous, right? It's all around us. And so, security through secrecy stance or through locking up things, I don't think works well, at least in the bio domain.
The thing that I believe is that we owe it to people to talk very frankly about where this is all going to go, and the societal implications and the way it's going to change people's lives. I think there is somewhat of a movement in both fields, which I personally find completely disgusting, to say, well, regular people, normal people can't handle like the full truth, and so we're just going to talk about like the short term, where we kind of cure some diseases with synthetic biology, and where we sort of like automate some labor, and kind of people's lives get like a little better and goods get cheaper. But like people are quite smart, and they can see the trends in technology quite well, and we are going to create digital intelligence systems that are smarter than humans, and we are going to create humans that are far more capable than the most capable humans of today. With the work that Ginkgo is doing and many others. And I think it does no one any good to pretend otherwise, and we need to have, in my opinion, very openly, a societal conversation about what that means. Technology has been doing this for a long time. The world changes, we make new tools, society gets radically transformed. This is sort of the way of the world, and this will be a more radical transformation than we've seen in the past, but viewed on like the long arc of technological history, it's the exponential just continuing to do its thing. And I think we just need to talk about that, and people kind of get that it's going to happen. And I think if you treat them with respect and with openness, they'll say like, all right, this is going to happen. And then we get to have the real conversation, which is how do we want it to happen? What limits do we want to put on it? If we can't stop it, which we certainly can't, how can we direct it? What is the world that benefits the most people? How do we take the most global input we can? And although the future is going to be very different, still have it be a future that people are excited about, have some autonomy over, have some say about, have some influence on. Separate to all of that, I think your question about secrets is good. I don't think it always works, but like we managed to keep the initiator of the atomic bomb secret for quite a long time. And I think there will be similar very important discoveries in these fields that we can hopefully keep somewhat secret, even if we talk totally about the implications, so that people with a bioreactor in their garage don't, create something super bad for a long time, hopefully.
More questions? Where are we? Yes, here we go. We have a couple here.
Hello, my name is Dewey Murdoch from the Georgetown CSAT. In the conversation you were having, Sam, about the competition that is pending, or is actually not pending, is underway, to build a super powerful AI computing system, platform, and all the like. The conversation got kind of close to what essentially becomes an arms race. And where multiple small number of organizations or countries are competing heavily, and they feel that competition deeply.
Yeah.
At the end of the conversation, you kind of pulled back with a comment about we ought to make sure we bake in safety and things like that. And that's great. I was wondering, since you are involved in kind of building these systems, for the audience here, could you just kind of describe how you're actually doing that? Where does that safety factor in? Could you make it a little bit more concrete for us?
Yeah, for sure. Again, I think people, it would be great to have a black or white, which is we're never going to compete, we're always going to compete. And that neither of those work. That's just not the way the world works. What will happen is there will be enormous competition because of the enormous economic value. But for all of our sakes, we need the efforts around the world to agree to, here are the areas where it's just too dangerous, and for all of our continued prosperity and existence, we're going to have these sorts of things in place about safety and testing the systems. And I'm actually newly optimistic, having had lots of conversations, even with some people that I don't consider friendly, that we'll be able to make that happen. Some of the specific things that we do, and there's a long list. One is that we have made the decision at OpenAI that we will release our powerful models behind an API, not just sort of hand out the model to the world. And this is not honestly super popular with the research community, but I feel very strongly that it's the right approach. It lets us see how a system is behaving. When it is behaving in ways that we don't want, we're able to correct it. It's not like we just put something out into the world and lost control. And I believe very firmly that these days of people training a big model and just sort of saying, here, world, have at it, I hope those days are numbered. So we think about controlled releases where we can enforce safety systems and we can make changes as we go. And I think this is something that hopefully everybody else is going to follow us on soon. We work internally ourselves and with lots of partners to monitor everything we put out. And so, for example, we're actively monitoring our new code generation product. So are our partners at Microsoft. We're looking for ways that is creating unsafe behavior or misuse that we didn't anticipate. And by being able to see everything happening there, we can, and we will, I'm sure, find safety issues we didn't think about. Generally speaking, I am a big believer that safe AI systems require iterative deployment. There is a belief in some efforts in the world that you should sort of build a super powerful AI in a vacuum, and then once you're totally sure and you've measured and it's safe, you can push the button and launch it. I do not think that will work. All of my indications about the way that technology has developed and society evolves suggest to me that it won't. And so I think safe iterative deployment, but that is always under control and the ability to pull it back, is how we're going to get to these long-term safe systems.
And let me add that the combination of all of these points creates more targets for cyber attack. So let's imagine we have 10 places that are behaving perfectly in the way that Sam has described, both in biology and in AI. They're also going to be the ones that everyone is going to be the most interested in. And so then the system perpetuates along the lines of what Risto has talked about. We have a question right behind you.
Could I quickly add something here?
I'm sorry, go ahead, Risto.
I think one of the big challenges will be faced by regulators, because it's their job to secure society and our lives. And as already discussed, they don't typically understand new technology very well. And you can take two approaches. You can regulate in advance. You can predict what kind of challenges will be faced, and you regulate them. Or you can regulate after the fact, after we have learned what went wrong, what doesn't work, what creates safety issues, and then regulation happens. And maybe to exaggerate a little bit, in Europe, we try to regulate everything in advance. And of course, we can't predict what technology will be used for, so typically we slow the progress down. In the US, you are much more in the realm of, let's see what happens, and then we'll figure out the right regulation. And then China is sort of in a different dimension because of their political reasons. They share some of the European challenges and some of the US degrees of freedom. But for safety of these systems and how we apply them, the regulator's role is a very challenging one and a meaningful one.
Thank you. We have one more question. This will be the final question.
Right, thanks. I'm Björn Fegerberg. I'm with the Swedish Embassy here in DC. So I wanted to pick up on your point, Risto, about people in government not knowing as much as they probably should about these technologies, and I fear that may sadly be true. But it would be interesting to hear what do you specifically, and maybe others on the stage, what are the most persistent and maybe the most problematic misperceptions and wrong ideas about machine learning and AI in general? How should we think differently, both politicians and civil servants?
Let's have each of the panelists ask this question in a broader way as a final question. So the way I would say this, let's start with Risto. What's it going to take to solve the problem of the government not understanding what they have to regulate, and what are the hardest problems?
Well, if I will skillfully answer a different question without nobody knowing. My own history, I think, is a good example of what many decision makers face. Being the chairman of Nokia, I was often in a situation where I had to give presentations that were written for me by someone else. And I know that you all have been there and done that. And sometimes the topics are such that I don't really understand them myself very well. And people in high decision-making positions, they get used to that. And they sort of forget that they can go back to school as well. And not just can, but they sometimes should. Because some new technologies, for example, are of such central importance to what their organization does, that they need, as the final decision maker, they need to understand that technology themselves. So I'd say that the biggest problem that the decision makers face is that they have forgotten that they can learn new things and that they should go back to school occasionally. Not become programmers like what I did. I started programming machine learning systems. I used to program 30 years back, and I restarted that. I'm not asking politicians to do that, but they should understand how this technology works. And they could easily spend 2 full days or a full week being educated on the technologies that will most change the world over the next 10 years. And that would be a great investment for us all.
Well said. Thank you very much, Risto. Reshma, how would you answer this question? How do we solve the knowledge, governance, people problem in biology? It's incredibly complicated.
Well, one of the things I've been impressed by with the Commission is your ability to elevate AI to be a topic that world leaders are talking about, right? And so I think in some sense the Commission has played an educational role for AI across countries and across different sectors of government. And I would argue that in the area of biotechnology, which actually featured quite prominently in the report, we need an equivalent commission to think about the biological domain and the implications for both economic security and national security. And so I would argue that that would be a tangible step in doing the same type of deep dive that was done by this commission in AI, we need a similar deep dive into biotechnology.
And I'm going to recommend you as a member of that commission. Sam, go ahead and sum up for us.
Yeah, I'll go super fast. I think the technology industry as a whole, with Eric as a very notable exception, has not done a particularly good job of engaging early with policymakers. And we, the industry and OpenAI in particular, would like the opportunity to do that differently. If any of you are trying to figure this out, you will find us open and receptive and as eager to engage as you will make time for. I think if I were a policymaker, my first priority would be insight, learning what's going on in the systems, maybe requiring that there's some sort of information that gets shared by the companies doing this. The field is still evolving so fast, I think it would be very difficult to write long-term regulation, but some short-term regulation that we all go in saying we know this is going to change because we can't predict where the technology is going to go could be great. But I think we're going to learn so much every year that the regulatory posture has got to be one of rapid iteration, where we try to say, you know, let's set these guidelines for this year and then reevaluate. I think that at the rate that the field is evolving, which is like far faster than I think any technological field I've at least seen before, that's the general posture I would take.
It's interesting if you look back at the Siilasmaa conference, which I think was 1987, in the time and the whole dawn of a new technology, the policies were ultimately struggled with largely by the scientists themselves, because they were the only people who at the time understood the implications of what the technology could do. I think what we're collectively trying to do here is to get everyone to understand the implications of what this is, so we can all participate in the way that the panelists have talked about, getting to the right outcome for the world. Thank you, all three of you, so much for doing this, and thank you all for participating in this.
Thank you.
I'll see you again. Thanks.
Thanks,